You ever notice how sometimes the prettiest life, the one people admire from the outside, can crack so quietly you don't even hear it until the pieces are already at your feet? That was Sophie's life, or at least the one she thought she built with Daniel, the husband who used to laugh into her hair like the future was a gift wrapped just for them. They had little routines that made the days feel sewn together. A kiss before work, the hum of her voice in the kitchen, the way he counted down the weeks to the baby like each one was a victory lap. And for a while, it really did look like a love story that could outlast time. Until it didn't. At first, it was just tiny absences, late nights at the office, the casual work stuff, explanation, dinners growing colder on the stove. She told herself it was stress, the season, the way life shifts when responsibility weighs heavier. But small cracks spread fast. One night, he came home smelling faintly of citrus and a cologne that wasn't his. She asked softly if it had been a long day, and he nodded without looking her in the eye. That's when Sophie learned silence can be louder than truth. The humiliation didn't come all at once. It leaked in. Like at that backyard barbecue, when Daniel smirked in front of his friends and called her dress curtains. Laughter rippled around the table, and Sophie held her smile together with pins. Margaret, his mother, stiffened beside her, warning in her voice, but Daniel shrugged it off as just a joke. Sophie carried that moment like a bruise you can't show, pressed to the fence in the corner yard, her palms trembling while Margaret brushed a crumb from her shoulder as if to say, "I see you," even if he doesn't. And then came the name, Lauren. First as gossip, then as perfume lingering on Daniel's shirts, finally as a woman in an emerald dress framed in glass, smiling like she knew the part she played in someone else's story. Sophie told herself 100 gentle lies to stay afloat, but the tide didn't care. At dinner one night, Daniel looked across the table and said maybe if she put in half the effort Lauren did, he wouldn't be the only man with a wife who looked ready for bed by 9. That was the night Sophie stopped mistaking cruelty for care. Still, she wasn't done breaking before she rebuilt. She found strands of blonde hair on his pillow, laughter through bathroom doors not meant for her, excuses that dripped with disdain. She asked if he still found her beautiful, and he answered with a sigh, "You're pregnant," as if motherhood erased womanhood. One night he said flatly, "You've stopped being the woman I married." And Sophie whispered back, "Maybe the woman you married expected to be loved through every season." He didn't even look up, but here's the twist Daniel never saw coming. Margaret. That woman had eyes like a hawk and a heart like steel wrapped in silk. She saw what was happening, and she wasn't about to let Sophie disappear into her own marriage. Margaret arranged a baby shower, brought in Elena, a designer friend, to craft a gown that shimmered gold like sunlight itself. Sophie slipped it on, and for the first time in months, she recognized the woman in the mirror. Not because she was flawless, but because she was hers again. The day of the shower, Sophie walked in and the room stilled. Conversations died mid-laugh. Every head turned. Even the traffic outside slowed just to see her through the glass. She wasn't the background anymore. She was the headline. Daniel froze at the bar, his glass halfway to his lips, watching his wife command the room without begging for his gaze. And when Lauren arrived in crimson, expecting the spotlight, the room barely shifted. The contrast was stark, one woman grasping for attention, the other simply radiating it. Sophie smiled, touched her belly, and in that single gesture told everyone, "I am not invisible." That be why the end of the night, Daniel offered her a ride home out of habit. Sophie shook her head, slid into Margaret's car, and left him standing in the doorway staring at taillights. The photos of her spread online like wildfire, comments flooding in about her glow, her strength, her beauty. Even Lauren faded after that, cutting Daniel off with one brutal line, "I don't compete for attention that's already decided." And just like that, the affair collapsed, not because Sophie fought for him, but because she stopped. When the baby finally came, Daniel wasn't there. He had another meeting. Margaret held Sophie's hand through the contractions, whispering courage into her ear, until Sophie's daughter cried her first cry into the world. Hours later, Daniel showed up, standing awkward in the doorway, watching a moment he no longer owned. Sophie looked up once, smiled politely, then turned back to the tiny heartbeat asleep in her arms. It was clear. The center of her world had shifted, and it didn't include his approval anymore. Weeks later, Sophie wore that same gold locket she'd chosen for her child, engraved with one word: strength. Daniel tried small gestures, flowers, tea, the kind of gifts you give when words won't land anymore. But Sophie had crossed a threshold. She wasn't cruel, just steady. And sometimes steadiness is the most radical revenge. One evening on the porch, Daniel said he wanted to do better, and Sophie folded another tiny shirt in silence before replying. Sometimes wanting comes too late. And that's where the story leaves us. Sophie no longer the girl waiting by the oven light for a man to come home, but a woman who walked into a room in gold and changed the ending. Daniel? He stood in the doorway, watching his own relevance slip through his fingers. And maybe that's punishment enough. Not rage, not revenge, but being forced to see what you lost when you thought she'd never leave the SO. Here's the question. Was Sophie right to carry herself with silence instead of rage? Should she have fought harder for her marriage? Or was her quiet strength the loudest answer of all? You tell me, because this isn't just her story, it's a mirror for all of us. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was justice served here? Or is this just the first chapter of another battle? And you know what's strange? Once Sophie stopped waiting for Daniel to notice her, it was like the whole world started noticing instead. Neighbors smiled differently. Strangers held doors a beat longer. Even her reflection seemed to look back at her with more loyalty than he ever did. Daniel tried. He really did in his clumsy way, dropping flowers on the counter, asking if she wanted tea, pretending small offerings could rebuild what months of silence had already taken. But Sophie wasn't cruel. She didn't slam doors or scream accusations. She just let his gestures float there between them like paper boats on water that would never reach shore. The thing about silence is, it forces people to hear their own noise. Daniel sat in that house, the same house he once built with her, and suddenly the laughter he had shared with someone else felt shallow, like a song that sounded good in a bar but didn't hold up in the daylight. Margaret, bless her steady heart, became Sophie's shield and anchor. She visited almost daily, folding baby clothes, bringing muffins, talking about the weather, but really saying, "I'm here, I see you, you're not alone." And maybe that was what Sophie needed most, not Daniel's late apologies, but the simple proof that loyalty can exist without conditions. The baby grew, those early weeks of sleepless nights and soft cries filling the house with a different kind of music. Sophie would sit in the rocker, her daughter pressed against her chest, whispering promises into the dark. You will always know your worth. You will never have to beg for love. Sometimes she caught Daniel watching them from the doorway, his expression unreadable, as if he wanted to step closer but didn't know how anymore. And maybe that was the real punishment. Not rage, not betrayal, but distance so thick that even when you stand in the same room, you're already on opposite shores. There was one evening. This is the part that still plays in my head like a film. Daniel finally broke. He came home early, no cologne on his shirt, no lies about meetings, just him standing in the kitchen with his hands shoved in his pockets. "I miss us," he said quietly, almost like a confession to the tiles beneath his feet. Sophie looked at him for a long moment, the baby's soft breathing filling the silence. She could have cried, could have let those words stitch her back into the version of herself that used to wait by the window. Instead, she rocked gently, her voice calm but firm. "I don't miss being invisible." And Daniel, for once, had nothing left to say. Word spread in town faster than she ever imagined. The baby shower pictures, the golden gown, the way Sophie carried herself. It turned her into something of a legend. Old friends reached out. People whispered her name with respect instead of pity. Even women she'd never spoken to sent messages saying, "Thank you. You reminded me who I am." And isn't that something? How pain can turn into a kind of torch, lighting the way for others who are stumbling in the dark. Lauren. She disappeared like smoke after fire. No dramatic exit, no final showdown, just silence on the other end of Daniel's phone. One last message that said she wouldn't fight for a man who couldn't even look away from his own wife. It wasn't Sophie's revenge, but it sure felt like justice delivered in someone else's handwriting. Life after that wasn't a fairy tale. It rarely is, but it was honest. Sophie learned to take walks with her daughter in the stroller, to write little notes in a journal about the kind of world she wanted to build for her, to laugh again without checking if someone else was laughing too. Daniel lingered, present but irrelevant, like a character who doesn't realize the story has already moved on. Sometimes he tried to reach for Sophie, not with his hands, but with softer gestures, showing up to appointments, folding laundry. But those were the things he should have done before love turned into survival. And maybe that's the lesson buried under all of this. You don't always need to fight loud to win. Sometimes the most devastating strike is choosing to grow so boldly that the other person can only watch from the sidelines. Sophie didn't just walk through fire, she walked out shining. And that image, the woman in gold who refused to be small, well, it stayed with everyone who saw it. Now here's where I'll leave it open, because that's life, right? Some say Sophie should forgive Daniel, let the family heal, give her daughter the picture-perfect home. Others say she's already healed more than enough, and the bravest thing she can do is close the door for good. What do you think? Is quiet dignity enough justice? Or should betrayal always demand a louder reckoning?